November 8, 1942, Guadalcanal. The sweltering Solomon Islands night is pierced by the distant thunder of naval guns. Rear Admiral William "Bull" Halsey has just arrived to inspect the Marines who have been locked in battle for 3 relentless months. He finds them gaunt, malaria-ridden, and sleepless. That night, Halsey himself experiences the terror they endure daily. Enemy destroyers trade shells with shore batteries, and in the skies above, a Japanese bomber circles endlessly, its uneven engine drone earning it the nickname Washing Machine Charlie. Flares drop, bombs scatter, and rest becomes impossible. For Halsey, the message is clear. If the Marines are to hold the island, they need protection from the sky, even in the dead of night. The Admiral leaves Guadalcanal, shaken but determined. Weeks later, he writes urgently to Washington, 6 radar-equipped night fighters must be sent to the South Pacific, or his men will collapse from exhaustion. The problem? The Marines don't have a single night fighter yet. No planes, no trained pilots, no doctrine. But from this desperate request will rise a squadron unlike any other VMF 531, the Gray Ghosts, America's first Marine night fighters. The concept of a night fighter was not new in 1942. Across the Atlantic, the British Royal Air Force had already faced the terror of German night bombing during the Battle of Britain. Searchlights and anti-aircraft guns could only do so much. The real breakthrough came with radar, radio waves that revealed enemy planes long before they reached their target. Ground controllers guided British fighters into position, and airborne interception radar allowed pilots to close in for the kill, even in pitch darkness. This marriage of radar and aviation gave Britain the edge it needed to survive those desperate nights. The US Marine Corps, however, had no such program. When Admiral Halsey pleaded for 6 radar-equipped aircraft for Guadalcanal, Washington had to admit the truth. Not a single Marine night fighter existed, but one officer had already seen the future. His name was Major Frank H. Schwabel. A Naval Academy graduate and experienced Marine aviator, Schwabel was sent to England in late 1941 as a special observer. His mission was clear: study the RAF night fighter system. For months, he immersed himself in British tactics, training, gunnery, and radar operations. He even attended the Fighter Director School at Stanmore, learning firsthand how controllers vectored fighters toward enemy bombers over the blacked-out skies of London. When he returned to America, Schwabel carried more than notes. He carried a vision. The Marine Corps must build its own night fighter squadrons. Permission soon came to license build the British radar sets in the United States, designated the SCR-540 for aircraft and the SCR-527A for ground control. By early 1942, the Marine Corps authorized 8 12-plane squadrons, though incredibly, the first was not expected to be active until 1945. For Schwabel, that was unthinkable. The war would not wait 3 years. He pushed hard, and headquarters relented. On July 25, 1942, Marine Night Fighter Squadron, VMFN 531 was born, with Frank Schwabel as its first commanding officer. From nothing more than an idea and a desperate need, the Gray Ghosts took shape. When Major Frank Schwabel took command of VMFN 531 in July 1942, he had little more than a name on paper. There were no planes, no radar sets, no established tactics, and not even a proper base. The squadron was ordered to organize at Cherry Point, North Carolina, a Marine air station still being carved out of swamp and pine forest. Conditions were primitive. Schwabel's office was nothing more than an unheated shed, furnished with 3 wooden packing crates. One served as his desk, the others as chairs. It was from this makeshift headquarters that the Marine Corps' first night fighter squadron would be built from the ground up. Men began to arrive, young aviators fresh from Pensacola, mechanics with little radar experience, and officers like Major John D. Harshberger, who would become Schwabel's fiery second-in-command, and Major Robert O. Bisson, a rated pilot who instead took charge of the squadron's ground-controlled intercept team. Both would soon wear the silver oak leaves of lieutenant colonel, an unusual arrangement that reflected just how large and technical the squadron was. This was no ordinary Marine unit, it was an experiment, combining air crews, radar operators, and controllers into a single team tasked with mastering a brand new style of combat. But there was still one major problem. The squadron had no night fighters to train on. The purpose-built Northrop P-61 Black Widow was years away from being operational. Single-seat Corsairs and Hellcats with radar would not be ready until mid-1943, so the Marines scraped together whatever they could find. At first, they flew trainers like the North American SNJ-4 and the Curtiss SNC-1. Then came several Brewster SB-2A Buccaneers, repossessed from a Dutch order. These planes turned out to be disasters: unreliable hydraulics, faulty controls, and even landing gear collapsing on touchdown. Within 2 weeks, 4 different Brewsters had suffered serious in-flight failures. Schwebel had no choice but to ground them all until his mechanics could make them airworthy. Despite these setbacks, the men trained relentlessly. They practiced flying blind, navigating by instruments alone, because at night there would be no horizon, no landmarks, only the glow of dials in a darkened cockpit. They drilled in coordination with ground controllers, learning how to be vectored toward a target they could not yet see. It was painstaking, frustrating work. But with every night flight, every simulated interception, the Gray Ghosts moved closer to becoming America's first true night fighters. As 1943 unfolded, Schwebel's Gray Ghosts still lacked a proper combat aircraft. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics finally made a decision. The Marines would use a modified version of the Lockheed PV-1 Ventura patrol bomber. It was never designed as a night fighter, but it was large enough to carry the bulky SCR-540 airborne interception radar, plus a crew of 3, a pilot, radar operator, and gunner. The Ventura was twin-engined, heavily armed with nose-mounted 50 caliber machine guns, and had the range to patrol the vast skies of the South Pacific. On paper, it looked like a workable solution. In reality, it was anything but. The conversion process was slow. Venturas had to pass through multiple depots for modifications first: Norfolk, Virginia, where 6 nose guns were added, then Quonset Point, Rhode Island, where radar and identification friend or foe IFF transponders were installed. By the summer of 1943, the squadron had only a handful of Venturas on hand, and none worked properly. Gun sights blocked essential instruments, radar sets flickered out mid-flight, oxygen and electrical systems failed regularly. Climbing to 20,000 feet took nearly an hour, and once there, the plane became sluggish and nearly useless against fast Japanese bombers. In his reports, Schwebel labeled the Ventura a makeshift night fighter. In his private notes, he was even harsher. If the Japs fly thousands of feet higher than our planes can physically reach, there's not one damned thing we can do about it. Still, the Marines pressed on. They stripped out de-icing gear, cabin heaters, and even armor plating, shaving almost 1,000 pounds to squeeze every possible knot of speed from the aircraft. They trained harder, flying night after night, working with ground control intercept units to practice the delicate dance of radar-guided interceptions. The Gray Ghosts knew the Ventura was far from perfect, but war waits for no one, and soon these flawed aircraft and the men who flew them would be tested in the skies over the Solomons. By August 1943, after a year of trial, training, and endless mechanical headaches, the Gray Ghosts were finally ordered overseas. But even deployment reflected the difficulties of their aircraft. Instead of moving as a single unit, the squadron had to depart in 3 groups, staggered over weeks because so many Venturas were still unready. 6 PV-1s sailed from San Diego aboard the escort carrier USS Long Island. The ground echelon and the radar team followed on separate ships. The rest of the air crews would not arrive until later, when their planes could finally be coaxed into working order. When Schwebel and his executive officer, John Iron John Harshberger, reached Guadalcanal at the end of August, they saw how much the battlefield had changed since Admiral Halsey's sleepless night 9 months before. The Americans now controlled multiple islands in the Solomon chain, New Zealand and Australian units guarded outposts, and US Army P-70 night fighters were already attempting to shield Guadalcanal. Navy radar-equipped Corsairs were also arriving in the theater. But the Japanese still launched nocturnal raids, especially from the massive base at Rabaul, sending bombers and floatplanes to strike Allied convoys under cover of darkness. The need for night fighters remained urgent. The Gray Ghosts established themselves at Banica Airfield in the Russell Islands on September 11, 1943. Immediately, They began modifying their Venturas further, stripping every unnecessary pound to improve speed and climb rate. Yet danger struck almost immediately. On September 16, during a routine night patrol, one of the squadron's crews, Lieutenant John Mason, Staff Sergeant Ralph Emerson, and Corporal John Burkett vanished without a trace. Despite days of searching, no wreckage was found. The loss was a crushing reminder that night flying was perilous, even without enemy fire. Throughout September and October, the Gray Ghosts flew nearly 50 sorties, intercepting Japanese aircraft over Bougainville. Yet, not a single confirmed kill was scored. Inexperience, technical failures, and the sheer difficulty of radar interceptions meant enemy bombers often escaped untouched. Supplies were scarce, too. Spare parts for Venturas were nearly impossible to obtain. Crews had to beg Australian and New Zealand squadrons for pieces or barter with US Army stocks on Guadalcanal. Every mission flown came at the cost of exhausting labor from ground crews just to keep the radar and engines functional. The Gray Ghosts were finally in combat, but success would not come easily. For weeks, the Gray Ghosts had flown patrols without scoring a single confirmed kill. Then, in November 1943, everything changed. In the early hours of November 14, a Ventura named Coral Princess prowled the skies southwest of Bougainville. Guided by a Navy destroyer's fighter director, radar operator Technical Sergeant Charles Stout made contact an enemy bomber, a Mitsubishi G4M1 Betty, closing from Rabaul. Captain Dwayne Jenkins pushed the Ventura into position while top turret gunner Sergeant Thomas Glennon opened fire. Tracer rounds ripped through the night and the Betty spiraled down in flames. At 4:18 a.m., the Gray Ghosts had their first confirmed kill. But triumph was short-lived. Just 3 weeks later, on December 3, Coral Princess and her crew rushed to defend an Allied convoy under heavy attack. Witnesses saw Jenkins's guns tear into a Japanese bomber before his Ventura vanished into the black sky. Radio silence followed. No wreckage was ever recovered. Jenkins, Stout, and Glennon were gone. The squadron's first victory had come with a bitter price. Still, the Gray Ghosts pressed on. On December 6, Squadron Executive Officer John Harshberger led his PV-1 Gertie the Goon into action. Vectoring in from a Marine ground control intercept team, his crew spotted the silhouette of a Japanese float plane, an Aichi E-13A Jake. At just 800 feet, Harshberger and his gunner unleashed a devastating burst. The seaplane lit up like a torch and plunged into the sea. It was the Gray Ghosts' first all-marine interception, proof that their tactics worked. From then on, momentum built. The squadron expanded its missions, carrying 100 and 500-pound bombs on night harassment raids against enemy camps and barge routes. By January 1944, Schwebel himself finally claimed his first kill, a Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bomber, ignited in a fireball so close he felt the heat scorch his Ventura's wing as he banked away. The Marines had learned to hunt in the dark. The Gray Ghosts were no longer just survivors, they were predators of the night skies. By early 1944, the Gray Ghosts had grown into their role as true night fighters. Every week brought more interceptions, more dangerous missions, and more proof that radar and teamwork could turn the tide of night warfare. But the victories came at a steep cost. On February 5 and 6, Lieutenant Colonel Frank Schwebel, flying his Ventura Chloe, was vectored onto a Japanese Betty bomber high over Dampier Strait. Straining the aircraft to its ceiling at 15,000 feet, Schwebel and his gunner closed in and unleashed a withering burst. The bomber spun into the sea, shattered by gunfire. It was Schwebel's fourth confirmed kill, yet his pride was tempered by loss. Just 3 days later, another Ventura crashed during takeoff in foul weather, killing Lieutenant Clifford Watson and his entire crew. Night fighting remained as deadly as combat itself. That same month, John Iron John Harshberger, Schwebel's hard-charging executive officer, nearly met disaster himself. While intercepting 2 Betty bombers, his Ventura was raked by 20mm fire, disabling 5 of his 6 nose guns and destroying his radio. Harshberger's gunner managed to cut down one of the Japanese aircraft before they limped back through friendly anti-aircraft fire to land nearly out of fuel. When asked later, Harshberger simply laughed and said, "Never had so much fun in my life." His fearless style became legendary among the squadron. February 1944 also brought change. After 269 combat hours and 72 missions, Schwebel was rotated out. The thoughtful, methodical architect of Marine night fighting handed command to Iron John Harshberger, whose aggressive leadership would define the Grey Ghost's next phase. Harshberger wasted no time leading by example. On his very first night as commander, he downed a Japanese float plane over Bougainville. The Grey Ghosts were now battle-hardened, but their fight was far from over. Under Harshberger's command, the Grey Ghosts entered the spring of 1944 with renewed ferocity. Patrols over Bougainville and the surrounding seas became routine, but the danger never lessened. On February 19, Harshberger scored another kill, blasting a Japanese float plane into the ocean. Yet that same night, tragedy struck. Lieutenant Thaddeus Banks and his crew disappeared during a low-level barge hunting mission. At sunrise, search planes found only scattered wreckage on the water. 3 more Grey Ghosts were gone. March brought both triumph and heartbreak. On the 14th, Harshberger and his crew in Gertie the Goon destroyed another float plane mistaken at the time for a Japanese Paul, though later confirmed as a Jake. Just a week later, disaster struck twice. 2 Venturas, flying in formation, collided over the sea when one clipped the other's wing. Both aircraft exploded in flames, killing all 8 crewmen. It was the squadron's single deadliest day. By April, the skies had changed. Faster, radar-equipped Navy Hellcats and Corsairs were taking over night patrol duties. The aging Venturas, pushed to their limits, were gradually withdrawn from the front lines. On May 6, Harshberger turned command over to Captain James Waymer, closing out a combat tour that saw him fly over 100 missions and spend 756 hours in the night skies of the Solomons. His record, 4 confirmed victories, countless sorties, and the respect of every Marine who served with him. The Grey Ghosts claimed one final victory on May 11, 1944. First Lieutenant Marvin Notestein and his crew chased down a Japanese float plane over Rabaul's Simpson Harbor. Without radar guidance, they cornered their prey as it prepared to land, blasting it out of the sky. It was VMFN 531's 12th and last kill of the war. By July 14, the Grey Ghosts flew their final mission over Rabaul. In September, the squadron was disbanded at Cherry Point, North Carolina. Yet, their story wasn't finished. A month later, they were reactivated to become the first Marine unit to field the new F-7 F-Tigercat night fighter. Though the war would end before they could fly it in combat, the Grey Ghosts had already written their legacy in fire and sacrifice. The Grey Ghosts of VMFN 531 entered the Pacific War with no blueprint to follow. They began with nothing, no planes, no doctrine, no radar experience, and were handed a flawed patrol bomber never intended for the role of night fighter. Yet, through determination, improvisation, and sheer courage, they made it work. In just 10 months of combat, they flew hundreds of sorties, destroyed a dozen Japanese aircraft, harassed enemy shipping, and shielded Allied forces during some of the most critical operations in the Solomon Islands. The cost was steep: 6 Venturas lost, 20 crewmen killed, and countless more nights of exhaustion and danger. But their work proved beyond question that night fighting was possible, and that radar-guided interceptors could protect men and ships under the cover of darkness. For pioneers like Frank Schwebel, who built the squadron from scratch, and John Harshberger, who led it through fire with relentless aggression, the Grey Ghosts left a mark far greater than their kill tally. They gave the Marine Corps the foundation for a future night fighter force, paving the way for radar-equipped Corsairs, Hellcats, and eventually the Tigercat. They also gave Admiral Halsey's Marines something priceless: the chance to sleep without fear of washing machine Charlie circling overhead. From makeshift beginnings in a Carolina swamp to the battle skies of Bougainville, the Grey Ghosts proved that determination could turn even an imperfect weapon into a shield of victory. Their story reminds us that history is not only written by the largest battles or the greatest machines. Sometimes, it is written by the men who refused to accept the darkness, who rose each night to meet the enemy head on. And in the night skies over the Solomons, the Grey Ghosts made sure that America would never again be powerless in the dark.